My name is Evelyn Stroud, and they called me difficult. Not because I shouted, not because I threw things or caused a scene. No, it was because I still had thoughts, opinions. Because I dared to say, no, I'm not cold when someone reached for a blanket I didn't ask for. Because I asked for the books I wanted to read, not the magazines they left in stacks like empty apologies. Because I remembered who I was before they decided I was someone to manage. So before you sit down and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now let me tell you a secret. No one ever teaches you about aging. It's not the wrinkles or the slowness that isolates you. It's how the world slowly lowers its voice around you as though you've gone deaf. As though you've become someone to be handled, not heard. I wasn't always this way, you know. I used to speak for a living. 35 years I stood in front of classrooms and recited words that mattered. Baldwin Dickinson Morrison. My students didn't always listen, but they always remembered how I made them feel alive with meaning. When I retired, my house echoed. My husband Charles passed a decade earlier. My daughter Jennifer called on Sundays short efficient like scheduling a tax meeting. She had children, a life 100 obligations. And slowly that voice I'd once used to move a room of teenagers grew quiet in my own walls. Until the fall. It wasn't dramatic. No sirens, no broken hips. Just a misplaced foot on a rug, a strange crunch in my knee, and a visit to the ER that ended with someone saying, "It's probably best if she isn't alone anymore." Funny how one little twist of bone can unravel a lifetime of independence. Jennifer didn't have room. Her home, she said, wasn't equipped. "You understand, Mom? It's for your safety." I nodded. That's what we do. When we're tired, we nod to end the conversation we're no longer allowed to lead. That's how I ended up at Hearthwood Residence. The name sounded gentle enough, hearth, like homewood, like nature. But it wasn't either. Hearthwood was beige. Beige walls, beige smells, beige music. Even the air was beige. They assigned me room 212, a twin bed, one dresser, a single window that overlooked the employee parking lot. I unpacked my life into a 4-drawer cabinet. Photographs, notebooks, bookmarks from old students, all shrunk to fit a space they called home. At first I played along. I smiled at the nurses. I said thank you to meals that arrived lukewarm. I sat politely in the rec room while a woman named Darlene played bridge over troubled water on an out-of-tune piano. But then something small happened. I asked for black coffee instead of decaf. "No caffeine after 4 p.m. Mins." Stroud the nurse replied. "I'm not a child," I said gently, "and I'm not on any medication that would be affected." Her smile tightened. "It's policy." That night, a note appeared in my file. Patient can be resistant to routine. Slightly combative. Combative. For wanting real coffee. 2 days later, I asked to opt out of chair yoga with Sandra. "I'd prefer to read," I said. The aide blinked at me. "But it's good for your blood pressure." I didn't argue. I simply didn't attend. That night, another note. Patient lacks compliance with scheduled activity. Monitor behavior. It became a pattern. Refusing sugar substitute. Resistant. Declining to join bingo. Disengaged. Correcting a misquote during trivia. Disruptive. The irony didn't escape me. All those years I told students to speak their truth, to push back when things didn't feel right. Now I was being written up like a high school delinquent. But I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was curious. I began noticing the women they called pleasant. They nodded, smiled at everything, never questioned their meds, ate what they were given, wore what was laid out. Some of them had stopped speaking entirely. Whether by choice or by condition, I couldn't tell. But I wondered, did silence make things easier? And more disturbingly, did they want me to go silent too? One morning, I walked into the lounge and overheard a young nurse barely older than one of my former students whispering to another, "She's a handful, that one. Miss Stroud always has something to say." I wanted to laugh. Of course I had something to say. That's what living does to you. It fills you with stories, questions, ideas. The real tragedy isn't when an old woman talks too much. It's when the world stops listening. But that moment did something to me. It didn't break me, it focused me. I went back to my room and opened one of the empty notebooks I'd brought. On the first page I wrote, "Day 1. They called me difficult. But they haven't seen anything yet. The notebook became my refuge. Each day I wrote down everything. Not just what happened, but how it felt. The coffee I didn't get. The silence after my questions. The way the aides looked at me like a riddle too tedious to solve. I wasn't documenting out of paranoia, I was documenting because memory is a form of protest. And no one expects old women to remember things. By day 7, the pattern was clear. They didn't want difficult, they wanted agreeable, docile, grateful. But most of all, they wanted silent. I started noticing the others, not the ones who chirped, "Good morning," on cue, but the ones who sat by the windows alone. Women like Mrs. Halberg, who once taught piano at Juilliard, or Clarissa Nguyen, a former architect who now stared blankly at her soup like it might explain what happened to her blueprints. They didn't speak much, but when I passed them, I always nodded. There was something sacred in acknowledgement, especially among those the world had forgotten. The staff didn't like when I sat with them. "Miss Stroud," they said, "why don't you join the others doing puzzles in the game room?" "Because I'm not missing," I replied. They didn't laugh. That afternoon, a nurse named Tanya entered my room with 2 small pills in a paper cup. I looked at them carefully. "I don't take those," I said. "They're just a mild relaxant," she replied. "To help with your sleep cycle." "I've slept fine for 78 years," I told her, "and I don't plan to change my method now." That night I found a note in my file. "Patient refuses prescribed sleep aid. Difficulty adjusting." Adjusting to what? To being handled like a fragile box no one wants to break, but no one wants to carry. But this wasn't just about me. During breakfast the next morning, I saw something that twisted my gut. Mrs. Halberg, hands, shaking, eyes cloudy, pushed away her food. "Too salty," she whispered. The aide scoffed. "You need protein," and spooned the mush back toward her mouth. Mrs. Halberg flinched like a child. I stood up. "That's enough." The aide froze. "Excuse me," she said. "No. That's enough." A moment of silence. Other residents looked up, eyes wide. The aide set the spoon down without a word and left the table. 10 minutes later, the floor manager, Miss Alston, cold-blooded in pearls, pulled me aside. "Miss Stroud," she said with a tight smile, "it's important that our residents feel safe and respected, but it's equally important you don't interfere with care." She wasn't being cared for, I said. She was being ignored. Miss Alston's smile thinned to a line. "I understand you're used to being heard, but we follow strict protocols." There it was again. That tone. That language of control disguised as care. That evening, I was asked to sign a behavioral compliance form. They said it was for record-keeping. I read every word and signed nothing. Instead, I went to the courtyard. The sun was setting soft orange low. There, beneath the mulberry tree, sat Clarissa, alone as usual. I sat beside her without asking. After a moment, she spoke, barely a whisper. "They used to call me stubborn," she said, "because I wanted my own chair in my own room." I nodded. "And now," she continued, "they just call me non-compliant. I don't correct them anymore." That was the first time she looked at me, really looked. I placed my notebook on the bench between us. "You should write that down," I said. Her eyes flicked to the cover, then back to mine. I forgot how she said. "No," I replied. "You just stop being asked." The next morning, I began placing blank pages under certain doors. Folded once, clean paper like a small invitation. Some ignored them, but a few didn't. One came back under my door. It read, "They called me uncooperative when I wanted to call my daughter, but they never gave me the phone. Signed only, R." Another, "They changed my medication without telling me. I was dizzy for a week. They said it was aging. It wasn't." And another, "I remember who I am. They do not." The notes kept coming. I kept writing. But the more I documented, the more I became watched. The staff started entering my room unannounced. "Just checking in," they said. They moved things slightly, placed small signs on my dresser. "Hydrate more. Time for gratitude." One afternoon, I found my notebook missing. I searched every drawer, every cabinet. Gone. My hands trembled. This wasn't just a book. It was my record, my proof, my voice. And it had been stolen. I stormed to the front desk. "Who took the notebook from room 212? The receptionist, a young man named Bryce, blinked like I'd asked him to recite Shakespeare backward. I don't know what you mean, ma'am. I stared at him. It had a red cover, spiral bound, labeled. It was on my desk yesterday. I can file a missing item report. I leaned in. Do that. But also know I remember what I wrote. I walked away before he could respond. That night, another folded note slid under my door. This one said, "They see you. Be careful. R." And for the first time since entering Hearthwood, I felt afraid. Not of dying, but of being erased before I could prove I was still alive. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat upright in bed, the window cracked slightly to let the wind whisper against the beige curtains. My notebook was gone, yes, but the memory of each entry was sharp, sharpened by fear now but still intact. The next morning during breakfast, I asked Ruth if she'd sent the note. She didn't answer with words, just raised her eyebrows slightly, then glanced down at her oatmeal. That was all the confirmation I needed. That's how it began. A quiet alliance between the so-called difficult ones. Over the next few days, the energy shifted. Not publicly, not in a way the staff could pinpoint, but we started noticing each other more: small nods, shared glances, silent acknowledgments. Clarissa offered me her seat during group movie night, which no one ever did. Mrs. Halberg placed a single yellow flower on my tray at lunch, just the stem bent slightly but intentional. We were still quiet, but now we were listening. I started keeping notes again, this time in code. I used the margins of crossword books and greeting cards. Inside a get well card for Janice L., I scribbled, "Meds changed without consent. 3 patients this week." I asked Ruth how long she'd been watching. "Since my 3rd month here," she said in her slow, measured voice. That's when they started calling me forgetful. "Were you?" I asked. She smiled. "I still remember the French Revolution. I think I'm fine." We both laughed quietly so as not to draw attention. Then she leaned in. "They changed my pills last winter. Without telling me." I fell in the shower. "Did anyone report it?" "No. They said I must have been confused." She paused. "But I remember the label was yellow before. It was blue that day." Ruth wasn't the only one. Within a week, I'd quietly confirmed 5 more stories from residents who were treated not like individuals, but like parts of a routine to be streamlined. Each story different, each one unrecorded, each woman silenced in a different way. But we weren't silent anymore. We started meeting under the pretense of knitting group, only none of us knew how to knit. We sat in a semicircle, needles in hand yarn untouched, and talked in riddles. Ruth would murmur, "The blue thread runs too long." I would reply, "Then maybe we unravel from the other end." It became a language, a rhythm, and we all knew what it meant. One day, a staff member named Carla Younger Softer, perhaps not yet hardened by routine, lingered near our group. I noticed how she watched us. She didn't interrupt, but she saw us, and that was dangerous, because when you start being seen again, you become a threat. A few days later, I was called into the social worker's office. "Evelyn M's," Hanley began. "We've been monitoring some of your recent interactions, and we're concerned." "Concerned," I repeated. "That's the word you use before you erase someone." She blinked. "We just want to make sure you're adjusting, that you're not stirring anxiety in others." "I'm not stirring anything," I said calmly. "They're already anxious. I'm just not pretending otherwise." Her smile was tight. "You've always had a strong personality, but here that can be misinterpreted, and we wouldn't want any misunderstandings." There it was again, the veiled threat in a floral dress. "I understand," I said, meeting her gaze. "Better than you think." She hesitated. "Your daughter Jennifer, she mentioned that you used to be a teacher." "I still am," I replied. "Only now the curriculum's changed." That night, I checked under my pillow, a habit I'd started since the first note disappeared. There was another folded paper, in Ruth's elegant slanted handwriting. "Carla might help, but trust slow. They monitor her too." And underneath it, "Remember Evelyn. They fear what they can't control." I sat there holding the note, staring out the window at the dull glow of street lamps beyond the staff parking lot. She was right. They didn't hate us. They feared us, because we still had fire. And fire, no matter how small, can spread if you're not careful. The next day, I decided to test something. At breakfast, when the nurse came around with the usual tray of scrambled eggs and apple slices, I smiled and said, Thank you. May I also have a copy of the day's menu? She hesitated. The menu. Yes. I'd like to know my choices. You have choices, don't you? She blinked. Well, yes, but we don't usually. I'd like to see them. She didn't move. So I stood up, loudly enough for the room to hear. I said, I'd like to see what's on the menu today. Other heads turned. Clarissa dropped her spoon. Ruth covered her smile with a napkin. The nurse eventually returned with a printed sheet, probably from the kitchen, and set it in front of me, without a word. I didn't even look at it. It wasn't about the eggs. It was about reminding them that I still knew how to ask, and that others might remember too. Later, Clarissa slid a napkin toward me, written in pen. I asked for a second opinion. They said I didn't need one. But maybe now I will. The cracks were forming. Small, yes, but spreading, and the beige walls of hearthwood, no matter how thick, weren't going to hold forever. They thought they'd built a fortress. But even fortresses crumble not from bombs, but from rain. Quiet, steady, persistent. We were the rain. By now the knitting group had grown to 7. None of us ever touched the yarn, but the click of our needles provided a comforting rhythm to our rebellion. We kept our voices low, our sentences coded, our smiles, appropriately, vacant whenever staff passed by. I took to calling us the Whisper Network. It wasn't official. No names were written, no meetings scheduled. But when something happened, a change in medication, a locked door that wasn't locked before a conversation overheard, the information flowed. We didn't share everything at once, just enough to keep the others alert. And more importantly, awake. Because sedation was the real enemy here. One night Ruth didn't come to dinner. The aides said she wasn't feeling well. They said it so easily. Too easily. I asked to see her. Denied. I asked again. Still denied. She's resting, they repeated. She's under observation. The next morning, I waited by the nurse's station. Calm. Still. My back straight as a question mark. When Nurse Tanya passed, I asked, How is Ruth? She's stable, she said, avoiding my eyes. She had a reaction to a medication adjustment. What was adjusted? I'm not at liberty to say, Miss Stroud. She didn't authorize a change, I said. Let's not jump to conclusions. But I already had. That evening, during our fake knitting circle, I spoke without speaking. I said Ruth was on a new stitch pattern. Clarissa's lips went white. She never approved any changes, Clarissa whispered. I know, I said. And now she's silent. Later that night, a folded napkin was pushed under my door. I unfolded it slowly. They did this to Lila too. She asked questions. Then they called her delusional. Moved her to the West Wing. Never came back. There was no signature. But I knew the handwriting. It belonged to Janice, the quietest among us. The one who used to be a courtroom stenographer, now nearly invisible. They'd been doing this for a while. Long enough to have practice. Long enough to get good at it. And now they were trying it with Ruth. I made a decision that night. I would get Ruth back. And I would make noise doing it. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Miss Alston, the floor manager. She declined. I requested again. Still declined. So I waited until she entered the lunchroom and stood up loudly enough for every resident to hear. Miss Alston, I called. Why has Ruth been removed without our knowledge or hers? The clatter of plastic forks and trays halted. Heads turned. Aides froze. Miss Alston blinked, then smiled, the kind of smile that's all teeth, no warmth. Miss Stroud, that's not appropriate. I'm not asking for appropriate. I'm asking for truth. You're disrupting meal service. Good. Because the service has been poor? A tense silence. Then from across the room, Janice's voice rang out, quiet but clear. She didn't consent to medication changes. The silence broke like glass. Another woman, Edith, I think, added. They changed mine last month too. Said the old ones weren't in stock? I was told mine were discontinued, said Clarissa. Now it was a chorus. And Ms. Alston, usually so calm, looked rattled. We'll address these concerns in private, she said, her voice clipped. I nodded. Yes, let's. They tried to isolate me after that. Took away my access to the lounge. Moved me to a new room on the East Wing. They called it routine reallocation. I called it containment. But it was too late. The Whisper Network didn't depend on proximity. We had momentum. A day later, I received a folded sheet tucked into a magazine. Ruth is in room 3A in the infirmary. No visitors allowed. But she's asking for you. My hands shook. That night, I slipped from my room using the hallway bathroom excuse. I walked slowly so as not to trip the motion sensors too quickly. When I reached the edge of the infirmary wing, I paused. The door was locked. But I had something better than a key. I had a favor. I knocked on the cleaning closet door. After a pause, Carla stepped out, the aide who'd always watched us just a little too closely. She didn't say anything, just looked at me, then at the locked door. Then she handed me a keycard. "I'm risking my job," she whispered. "I'll protect you," I said. She almost laughed. "You're just an old woman." "No," I replied. "I'm a witness." That made her pause. Then she nodded and stepped back into the closet. I swiped the card. The door clicked open. Inside, I found Ruth, pale but awake. Her eyes flicked toward me. "About time," she whispered. "What did they give you?" I asked. "They said it was a mood stabilizer, but it made me forget words." "Are you okay now?" "Better," she said. "But Evelyn, we have to finish what we started." "I know," I said. And for the first time since entering Hearthwood, I didn't feel old. I felt electric. We had their attention now, and soon the world would too. The next morning, I woke up with the same clarity I used to feel before standing in front of a classroom. That mix of purpose and defiance. The staff thought they'd broken the chain by isolating Ruth, but all they'd done was give us proof. Proof that they were willing to sedate silence and disappear anyone who didn't comply. And now Ruth was back. Weak, yes, but alert. And angry. That fire she carried, the one they tried to extinguish, was burning again. And with her words starting to come back slowly, carefully, she was ready to fight. We needed evidence. Not just scribbled napkins and whispered stories. Something undeniable. Something legal. So I took a risk. I approached Carla again. She was folding sheets in the laundry room when I entered. "Just for 5 minutes," I said. "That's all I'm asking." She looked up, weary but not unwilling. "What now?" "A voice recorder." She flinched. "Evelyn, it doesn't have to be visible. I'll return it." "You're playing a dangerous game." "No," I said. "I'm ending one." Her eyes held mine. Then slowly she reached into her scrub pocket and passed me a small black device no bigger than a thumb drive. "It only records for 40 minutes, she said. "Use it wisely." I slipped it into my sleeve and nodded. "You just gave the voiceless a weapon." That night, I brought it to the knitting circle. Clarissa stared at it like it was a grenade. "Do you know what you're doing?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I'm listening." "For all of us." I pressed record, and we spoke. Not in code, not in whispers. We spoke plainly as women who had been flattened by the system and were now unfolding. Clarissa told the story of how they swapped her thyroid medication 3 times in 1 month without explanation. Janice recounted the day she was denied a phone call to her son because it wasn't Wednesday. Another woman, Dora, spoke of being restrained during a panic attack while a staff member mocked her accent. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. It was just truth. Raw, personal, clear. The kind of truth that doesn't need volume to pierce. After 40 minutes, the red light blinked off. I slipped it back into my sleeve. The next day, I called Jennifer, my daughter, my always busy, always distant daughter. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Mom." "Hi, darling," I said, keeping my voice light. "I need a favor." There was a pause. "Everything okay?" "Just fine. But I need you to come by this week. In person." "Why?" "I have something to give you. Something important." She hesitated. "I have work." "Jennifer," I interrupted. "If you don't come this time, I won't call again." Silence. Then quietly, "I'll be there Thursday." I smiled. "Bring your law school friend. The one who interned with that patient rights firm." Another pause. "Okay." When Thursday came, I was waiting in the courtyard. Red cardigan, buttoned hair, pinned neatly, the recorder in my coat pocket. Jennifer arrived in sunglasses, her friend Maya beside her holding a leather satchel. "Mom," Jennifer said, "what's going on?" I didn't waste time. I took out the recorder and handed it to Maya. "What's this?" 40 minutes of elder abuse," I said. "Documented. Named. Real." Maya blinked. "You recorded them?" "No, I recorded us." Jennifer looked lost. I turned to her. They've been changing medications without consent, isolating people, silencing us when we speak up. And no one listens. But you work in communications. And your friend, she knows the law. Maya's hands tightened around the recorder. This is admissible, she said softly. I nodded. And I have more. Jennifer still wasn't speaking. Her face had gone pale. I know you thought I was being dramatic, I said. But being called difficult doesn't mean someone's crazy. It usually means they're inconvenient. Her voice broke. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I did. You just weren't listening. She dropped her gaze. I softened. But you're listening now. That's all that matters. By the next week, Jennifer had filed an inquiry with the Department of Elder Affairs. Maya passed the recording through the right legal channels. And Hearthwood. They panicked. Suddenly, my door was knocked on daily, not by aides, but by administrators. Is there anything you need, Ms. Stroud? Would you like to revise your care plan? Can we interest you in a private suite? Too late. I wasn't the only one anymore. Clarissa's son, a quiet man, who once brought her jellied sweets and said little else, marched in with a clipboard and a social worker. Janice's cousin wrote a blog post that went viral. Dora's granddaughter was a local reporter. And Ruth, sweet sharp. Ruth sat upright in a wheelchair, clutching the recorder like a relic. She whispered, "They won't sedate me again." We weren't difficult anymore. We were witnesses. We were voices. We were fire. And the world was watching. They tried to silence us, but the silence broke. Once the inquiry was filed, Hearthwood's polished veneer began to crack. Not immediately, these places know how to protect themselves. But the shift was there, subtle at first. Gone were the cheerful, practiced greetings from staff. Gone was the overly sweet music in the halls. In its place, tension. The air felt electric with anticipation, as if the building itself knew its secrets were being dragged into the light. For the first few days, the administration's tactic was charm. A new dessert cart rolled through lunch. Fresh flowers appeared in the hallways. Resident Appreciation Week posters were slapped onto bulletin boards. But we knew better. These were not gifts. They were distractions. Camouflage for panic. I received a formal letter from Hearthwood's legal department. It was 2 pages long, filled with gentle threats. Phrases like privacy concerns, facility reputation allegations, potentially defamatory. I read every word, then calmly folded the letter and slid it into the inside cover of my newest notebook, right next to my outline for a local op-ed. Because I wasn't finished yet. This wasn't about comfort anymore. It was about correction. Jennifer called that night. They're trying to get ahead of it, she said. They've hired a crisis PR team. Of course they have, I replied. Image management is cheaper than accountability. But it's working, she added. The press is hesitant. They think it's a he said, she said. They want proof of harm, not just discomfort. I smiled. Then we'll give them that. Over the next week, the Whisper Network turned into a full-blown operation. Carla, the aide who had first lent me the recorder, became our quiet courier. She slipped phones into common areas and turned on the voice memos. She printed blank consent forms so we could mark how often we were asked to approve changes to medication. The answer across the board: almost never. Clarissa's family dug through old pharmacy bills and found a half-dozen charges for prescriptions she had never requested. Dora's granddaughter, the reporter, began interviewing former Hearthwood staff, some of whom admitted anonymously that the policy of behavioral compliance was real. Ruth recovered more each day. Her voice no longer quivered. In one group meeting, she lifted her chin and said clearly, "I remember being held down by 2 staffers while I screamed. They said I was hallucinating. But I wasn't." She paused, then added, "I was just angry." And why shouldn't she have been? Anger is not a symptom. It's a signal. On a Friday morning, we received news that changed everything. One of the staff whistleblowers, a nurse named Lydia, who had quit the previous year, sent us a scanned document. It was an internal memo from Hearthwood Management. Subject: Resident Compliance Scoring System. It was real. It was signed. And it was damning. Each resident was assigned a private cooperation index ranking how often they followed staff instruction without hesitation. The lower your score, the more likely you were to receive mood stabilizers, activity, isolation, or corrective behavioral therapy. Ruth had been a level 3. I was a level 2. No one was allowed to see their score. Until now. We printed it out. Every page. We made copies. Gave one to every resident who could still read. Left extras in the mailroom and the garden shed. No one talked about bingo that day. Or pudding. Or weather. They talked about their scores. And about what they were going to do about them. The staff couldn't keep up. That evening, I was summoned to the director's office. He was a slick man with combed-over hair and an expensive tie that tried too hard to say "trust me." He smiled like a ventriloquist. Tight lips, hollow eyes. "Miss Stroud," he said, "we're concerned that the recent unrest among residents has created a hostile environment." "No," I said. "You created the hostility. We just finally recognized it." He steepled his fingers. "I'd like to offer you a solution. A private room, no shared bath, new mattress, better lighting. You'll be more comfortable. In exchange, we ask that you refrain from any more organized complaints." I almost laughed, as if this had been about room size. "I don't need better lighting," I said. "I need better ethics." He stiffened. "You're putting the entire facility at risk." "Good," I said. "It was never safe in the first place." He leaned forward, voice low. "You think this story will go anywhere? Elderly residents making claims without video, without medical proof. The world won't believe you." And for a moment I understood everything. That was their strategy all along. To count on the world not believing us. To exploit the assumption that our voices don't matter. That we forget. That we fade. But they were wrong. Because some of us remember, some of us write, some of us like me never stopped speaking. I stood, straightened my back, smiled. "You're going to regret underestimating difficult women." And I walked out. When I returned to the courtyard, Ruth was waiting for me. So was Clarissa. And Janice. And Dora. I looked at them and then passed them to the others who now watched us with something new in their eyes. Not fear. Not confusion. But readiness. I said, "We're going public." And no one objected. We didn't need a revolution. We just needed someone to listen. That Monday morning, Jennifer walked through the Hearthwood front doors, not as a daughter, but as a public relations strategist with a folder in her hands and a journalist behind her. Not just any journalist, Dora's granddaughter Sophia from a respected regional paper. She had fact-checked every claim, verified every medication switch, cross-checked insurance charges, and confirmed testimonies from 2 former staff members. Jennifer's posture was tall, her heels sharp on the linoleum floor. I hadn't seen that fire in her eyes in years, perhaps. Not since she gave her valedictorian speech at 17 hands, trembling but voice steady. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked before we entered the director's office. "Yes," I said, "but we're not doing it here." We held the press conference in the garden. Not because it was picturesque, it wasn't. The roses were withered, the benches rusted. But it was ours. It was where Clarissa once whispered her first memory of being over-medicated. Where Janice had taught me how to fold a note so it couldn't be easily unfolded without tearing. Where Ruth, just a week ago, had looked up at me and said, "They can't sedate the truth." Now, under the weak morning sun, we sat in a circle again, but this time with microphones clipped to our collars. Cameras surrounded us. Staff watched from windows, nervous and fidgeting. Miss Alston stood behind the hedges, her arms crossed like a gate, trying to stay closed. Jennifer opened the conference with a statement. "We are not here to sensationalize. We are here to illuminate." Hearthwood Residence is one of many facilities that has turned elder care into quiet coercion, a system where compliance is rewarded and independence is punished. Then she stepped back and let us speak. Clarissa went first. Her voice was measured factual, like drafting a blueprint in the air. "They changed my prescription 4 times in 2 months. When I complained, they said I was confused. I wasn't." Janice followed. "I asked to call my nephew when my balance felt off. They told me family calls are limited to Tuesdays and Thursdays. By Friday, I was hospitalized for dehydration." Ruth's words were slower, her recovery still uneven, but there was steel beneath them. "They said I was delusional, that I didn't know where I was. But I remembered the name of the nurse who held my arms down. And now so will you. Then I stood. And I told them what it really meant to be called difficult. Difficult is what they call you when you still want choices. Difficult is what they call you when your mind outpaces their convenience. Difficult is code for, we don't want to deal with your soul. I held up the memo from Hearthwood's own compliance scoring system. They quantified our cooperation. They rewarded silence. And they used kindness like camouflage. A murmur passed through the crowd. Cameras zoomed in. I looked at the press. And if this is how they treat the articulate, the alert, imagine how they treat the forgotten. The ones who can't speak. The ones without daughters and granddaughters. The ones who pass quietly in beige rooms while no one pays attention. Then I said what none of them expected. We're not angry. We're awake. And we are not going back to sleep. That night, the story aired. Not just regionally, it made national news. Silent rebellion. Women in senior care facility expose systemic abuse. The headline flashed beneath images of Clarissa's trembling hands, Janice's voice cracking mid-sentence, and me staring directly into the camera like I was looking down the barrel of a gun and daring it to blink first. Hearthwood issued a statement. Polished. Sanitized. They called the claims unfounded. Our recordings selectively edited. Our motives misguided. But it was too late. The public saw through it. For every woman like me who stood on camera, 100 others sent letters, emails, tweets, stories, daughters, sons, nieces, volunteers, former nurses, people who had seen things and now had the courage to say them aloud. Within 2 weeks, the Department of Health opened an investigation. An unannounced inspection revealed unfiled incident reports, expired medications, and multiple instances of unauthorized medication changes. The director was placed on leave. Miss Alston resigned quietly. 3 aides were dismissed, and a federal review of elder care facilities with similar behavioral scoring systems was launched. We didn't celebrate. This wasn't a victory. This was survival with evidence. But still, there was something electric about it. Clarissa began sketching again. She hadn't held a pencil in years. Janice wrote a letter to the editor that ran next to Sophia's second exposé. Dora. She finally slept through the night. And Ruth stood in the hallway one morning smiling at nothing in particular and whispered to me as I passed, "They're afraid of us now." I paused. "No," I said. "They're finally seeing us." But the work wasn't done. With Jennifer's help, I began organizing workshops, advocacy sessions for residents. We taught them how to request their medical records, how to document, how to ask questions, how to say no. We taught them how to be difficult, proudly, publicly, together. Because here's the truth. Difficult women change the world, not through anger, through insistence, and sometimes through one quiet word passed across a courtyard. Speak. After the news coverage died down, people assumed everything went back to normal. But there is no normal after awakening. You don't just return to puzzles and pudding and pre-approved music once you've tasted what it feels like to be heard again. What came after wasn't a revolution. Revolutions are loud. This was quieter, deeper, like roots moving beneath the surface. Hearthwood hired a new director, a woman named Gloria, with salt-streaked hair and orthopedic shoes that didn't squeak on the vinyl floors. She was polite in a practiced way, but you could tell she'd read the reports. She'd been sent to clean up a mess without disturbing too much dust. I met with her once. She asked, "What would you like to see changed here, Ms. Stroud?" I said start by removing the compliance charts. Then talk less and listen more. To her credit, she didn't argue. The knitting circle dissolved. Not because it failed, because it had done its job. We stopped pretending. No more fake yarn, no more coded glances. Now we met openly in the library every Wednesday. We read articles, we held discussions, and sometimes we just sat in silence together. Not the kind forced upon us, but the kind we chose. Ruth still brought her recorder. Not to expose anymore, just to document. Memory fades, she said one day, but stories don't. Clarissa took up her sketching again with fervor. One afternoon, she handed me a pencil drawing of the Hearthwood courtyard, but instead of benches and hedges, she had drawn figures, women standing tall, their shadows stretching beyond the borders of the page. I hung it on my wall. Right above the folder that now held signed affidavits, news clippings, and the memo from the behavioral compliance system. But for all the movement forward, there were those who couldn't. Janice passed away 2 months after the press conference. She had a stroke in her sleep. Quiet, they said. Peaceful. We gathered in the lounge that afternoon. A few residents cried. Some staff offered a moment of silence. But I said something else. She was not peaceful, I said softly but clearly. She was powerful, and she will be remembered not as a woman who died in a care home, but as a woman who reminded us how to live with dignity. Afterward, Dora placed a single folded napkin on Janice's empty chair. It read. She spoke when others whispered. I started receiving letters. At first, just a trickle. Daughters thanking me, caretakers apologizing, strangers reaching out. Then bundles. I received a letter from a woman in Vermont who said her mother was labeled non-cooperative after refusing to hand over her wedding ring to staff for safekeeping. Another from Oregon, a nurse who admitted she left her job because she was told to dose the talkers. They called it incident prevention. I called it what it was, silencing. Each letter a story, each story a warning, each warning a mirror. I read every single one. Some I answered, some I filed away, some I cried over. All of them reminded me why I hadn't stopped. One day, a young volunteer named Theo stopped me in the hallway. He was no older than 22, fresh-faced, wearing a faded comic book pin on his lanyard. He looked nervous. Missy Stroud, he asked. Can I ask you something? Of course. Were you always this brave? I smiled. No, I said. I was always this loud. The bravery came when no one else was loud with me. He looked confused. So I added, being the first voice in a silent room is terrifying. But when someone joins you, that's when fear turns into fire. He nodded slowly and then with a small smile said, well, I'm listening. I placed a hand on his arm. Then you're already braver than most. The director tried to move on from our uprising. She installed new programs, hired new staff, replaced the beige walls with pastel ones. But a fresh coat of paint doesn't change what lives in the foundation. And the foundation had shifted. Because now when new residents arrived, they were met not with pamphlets about bingo and movie night, but with us. We greeted them, sat with them, asked, what matters most to you here? And when they hesitated, we listened. It became our ritual, to remind them, you are not alone. You are not crazy for asking questions. You are not difficult. You are awake. One afternoon, a woman named Bernice moved into room 210, just 2 doors down from me. She was quiet, watchful. Her son wheeled her in, whispered something to the nurse, then left without a backward glance. That night, I knocked on her door with a cup of chamomile tea. She looked at me like I was a stranger from another planet. I don't want trouble, she said. I smiled gently. That's what I said once too. I handed her the tea. Just so you know, we have a library group on Wednesdays. No knitting required. As I turned to leave, she called out, are you Evelyn Stroud? I stopped. I heard about you, she said. They say you changed this place. I paused, then replied, no, we did. And I walked back to my room, quiet, yes, but never again silent. The calendar turned slowly, as it always does when you're older. Days blend into each other, and the seasons seem more like background actors than main characters. But inside Hearthwood, the quiet rhythm had shifted permanently. There was no going back to how things were. Residents now held weekly advocacy circles not because they were protesting every little thing, but because they had finally remembered what it meant to have agency, to have choice, and to be heard. The administration responded the only way it could, by pretending this was all part of the plan. They created a new title, Resident Engagement Liaison. They assigned Carla to it. Of course, we all knew Carla had been doing that job long before it came with a name or a raise. Let them dress it up, Ruth said one day as we sat in the courtyard. It just means we won. Jennifer visited more often now. Not every week, but more than I expected. Her phone was still always buzzing in her purse, but when we talked, she listened. Not just with her ears, with her eyes, with her posture, with that invisible thread. Daughters sometimes lose when they grow up and their mothers shrink. She'd bring me articles, legislation in the works, lawsuits forming against other facilities, patient rights reforms gaining momentum. "Did you ever think you'd be an activist, Mom?" she asked once, half laughing. I sipped my tea. I always was. I just had a bigger classroom now. One afternoon, a young journalist came to interview me for a podcast. Her name was Noelle. Her voice was soft, but her questions cut with precision. "Do you think the term difficult is always weaponized?" she asked. I smiled. "It depends who's holding the weapon." She blinked. "See," I continued, "when a young man speaks up, he's assertive. When a young woman does, she's bold. But an old woman," I leaned in, "she's difficult." "Why?" "Because she's harder to gaslight." Noelle sat back in her chair. "You know," she said, "that might be the most powerful sentence I've heard in this whole series." "Then don't cut it," I said. And I meant it. Weeks passed. Ruth's health declined. Not in a sudden dramatic way, more like a slow retreat. She began missing meals. Her sentences shortened. The fire dimmed but never went out. One evening she called me to her room. I found her sitting in bed wrapped in the same lavender shawl she'd worn the day we met. On her nightstand, the recorder, the original one, sat next to a framed photograph of her younger self standing beside a chalkboard in a classroom. "I want to leave this with you," she said, motioning to the recorder, "in case you need it again." I took it gently, holding it in both hands. "I hope I won't," I said. She nodded. "But, if you do, don't wait this time." I looked into her eyes, sunken now but clear. "I won't." She smiled. "Good. Because difficult women, we don't go quietly." Ruth passed away 3 days later. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't sad, I was deeply. But grief, I've learned, has many shapes. Sometimes it's sobbing, sometimes it's silence, and sometimes it's legacy. We held a gathering, not a memorial. Ruth would have hated that. We called it the Difficult Woman's Garden. Each resident who had ever spoken up or wanted to place a stone around a small sapling tree we planted near the courtyard. We named it after her, not with a plaque, but with stories. She once asked why the fire alarm never worked during drills. Clarissa said, placing her stone. "She taught me how to fold letters so they didn't tear." Dora added, "She remembered what they wanted us to forget." I said quietly as I laid my stone last. The tree wasn't special, just a maple. But in time it would grow, just like we did. More letters came, more visitors, more stories. I received one from a woman in Kansas who had read about us in a retirement newsletter. Her husband had been labeled combative because he refused to give up his daily walk. After reading our story, she contacted an elder rights group, and the facility reversed their decision. She ended her letter with, "Thank you for reminding us that old doesn't mean voiceless, just harder to drown." I pinned that to my wall, right beneath the sketch Clarissa gave me and next to the memo still visible, still powerful. Every so often a new resident arrives who looks around with wary eyes. You can see it immediately. They've been somewhere where their words cost them something, where silence was survival. And every time I walk up to them, offer them tea, tell them my name, I don't start with the rebellion. I start with a question: what would you like to change? Because here's the truth. They thought labeling us difficult would end the conversation. But for women like Ruth, like Clarissa, like Janice, like me, difficult is just the first word of the story. The rest. We write together. It had been almost a year since we first spoke out. A year since the recorder first clicked on, since Ruth whispered her warning, since the walls of Hearthwood began to tremble under the weight of truth. And yet some days felt just as fragile as the ones before the uprising. Because silence is persistent. It waits in the corners. It lurks beneath. That's just how it is. And we're doing our best. It disguises itself as routine, as policy, as kindness. But we'd learned how to see through that now. I woke one morning to a knock on my door. Not the usual knock, not staff with meds or meal trays. This one was softer, hesitant. It was Bernice. She had only been at Hearthwood for 2 months, but she was already being called set in her ways. Which meant, of course, she still had ways. Good. She entered, clutching a manila folder to her chest. "I need help," she said simply. I gestured to the chair. "Sit. Tell me everything." She opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside, a letter from her insurance provider, a care plan signed without her consent, and a billing sheet showing she'd been charged for sedative supervision. "I never asked for sedatives," she said, voice cracking. "I didn't need to ask. I'd seen it before. Different name. Same story." "You're not alone," I said. "We can fix this." I walked her through it. We drafted a letter not angry but precise. We requested a copy of her full medical chart and a detailed log of any prescriptions administered in the last 60 days. We sent it certified mail with return receipt. "Will they retaliate?" she asked. "Maybe," I said. "But now you're not invisible." Later that week, she received a visit from the new head nurse. Polite, smiling. "Too many teeth?" "We just want to make sure you're adjusting well, Bernice." The nurse cooed. Bernice didn't flinch. "I'd like my medication list printed and reviewed with me daily," she said. "And from now on, I'll sign off before anything is administered." The nurse blinked. "That's not our standard." "It is now," Bernice replied. And just like that, another fire lit. Clarissa began designing small booklets, resident rights in plain language. She used large fonts, diagrams, checklists. They were brilliant, clear, beautiful. Dora translated them into Spanish. Theo, the volunteer, printed stacks of them after hours. We placed them in the library, quietly, then on bulletin boards, then brazenly in the staff break room. They were removed, so we posted more. Eventually, the new director sighed and said, "Fine, leave them." We smiled. That was how it always started. Resistance, removal, reluctant acceptance. We knew the pattern by now. Meanwhile, Ruth's tree began to grow. It was taller now, its young trunk sturdy branches reaching. Clarissa tied a red ribbon to one branch every time someone asked a question about their care plan. By mid-June, there were 16 ribbons, each one a whisper that turned into a demand, each one a woman or man who had refused to be handled. I added a ribbon myself after helping a former librarian named Edith get her hearing aid replaced. The staff had told her it was too late to adjust. It wasn't. She cried when she could finally hear the birds again. She cried harder when I said, "You were never the problem. They just stopped speaking your language." One evening, I sat alone in my room thumbing through the old notebook. The first one, the one they stole. Carla had returned it to me weeks after the press conference found it in a locked drawer while reorganizing medical storage. Inside were my original entries. Day 1. They called me difficult, but they haven't seen anything yet. Day 4. They told me decaf was policy. I told them I still had a pulse. Day 10. They watch me now. I'm glad. Let them watch. I traced the ink with my finger, remembering who I was when I wrote those words. Alone, uncertain, still hoping someone might believe me. And now, I no longer needed belief. I had witnesses. Jennifer called that night. "They're passing a bill," she said. "A real one. About informed consent in elder care facilities. Your story was cited in the committee testimony." I blinked. "Is that public record?" "Yes," she said. "You're in it. So is Ruth and Clarissa. They even quoted your line." "Which one?" She paused, then recited, "Difficult is what they call you when your mind outpaces their convenience." I smiled. "They kept that, huh?" "They did," in bold. For a moment, I just sat with that. It wasn't about fame or vengeance. It was about the ripple. You throw a stone into silence, and it echoes in places you'll never see. The next morning, Theo brought a small box to our reading circle. "What's this?" Clarissa asked. He opened it gently. Inside were 10 recorders. New. "Still in their packaging." "The university heard about you," he said. "They're donating these to your library. Said you should keep telling your stories." Clarissa laughed. "They want us to record our memoirs." "No," I said. "They want us to record truth." Theo grinned. "And maybe teach others how." Ruth would have liked that. We took one out that afternoon and passed it around. Each of us said something into it, not dramatic, just real. Clarissa. "They used to call me quiet. Now they call me prepared." Dora. "They said I wasn't lucid, but I remember every injustice." Bernice. "I never wanted to fight, but they picked the wrong woman to underestimate." And then me. "I was never difficult. I was just waiting for the world to remember that I existed." I clicked stop. Silence followed. But it wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of resistance, of fire, of women who refused to die before they were done speaking. I didn't expect the letters to keep coming, but they did. Thicker envelopes, heavier words. Some were handwritten, others typed. A few arrived with shaky cursive and water-stained corners. Almost all of them started the same way. I saw your story. I thought I was alone. They came from nursing homes in Florida, assisted living facilities in Ohio, memory care units in Oregon. Some wrote on behalf of a mother or father. Some were from residents themselves. And a few, the most heartbreaking, came from staff. I was told not to ask questions. They said if I gave the wrong pill, just keep quiet. I'm afraid I'll be fired, but I can't unsee it. We weren't just voices anymore. We were a network, a movement, an awakening that started with a red notebook and a woman they labeled difficult. I proposed something bold to the director. A public forum held at Hearthwood, a real event, residents, staff families, even policymakers invited. Not a PR stunt, a reckoning. To my surprise, she didn't shut it down. She didn't embrace it either. She simply sighed and said, "If you're going to do it right." So we did. Clarissa designed flyers. Dora contacted local advocacy groups. Theo created a webpage. Jennifer reached out to lawmakers. We titled it, "The Right to Speak." The day of the event, Hearthwood transformed. The beige lobby was replaced with banners bearing our chosen motto, "We are not what you remember. We are who you forgot to ask." Rows of folding chairs filled the courtyard. Staff hovered at the edges, unsure whether they were supporting or on trial. Residents shuffled in, some with walkers, some wheeled in by their children, all wearing small red pins, our silent symbol of resistance. I took the podium, heart thudding. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't falter. I began with what they tried to take. My name is Evelyn Stroud, and I was labeled difficult. But the truth is, I was awake. I told them about Ruth, about the Whisper Network, about what it feels like to be sedated not just with pills, but with disregard. We were not angry women. We were not paranoid. We were not senile. We were witnesses. And then I paused, looked out at the faces in the crowd, younger, older, skeptical, tearful. Then I said, and the worst part, we almost believed them. Almost. A quiet gasp ran through the courtyard. Clarissa followed me with a reading of excerpts from the anonymous letters. Dora shared a translated story from a Cuban woman who hadn't spoken in months until she heard her roommate cry in Spanish and whispered, "I'm still here." One by one, they came forward. Family members, aides, administrators with trembling notes in their hands. And for once, no one interrupted. No one redirected. No one managed the emotions out of the room. We let them stay. Later that night, back in my room, I sat by the open window. The night was cool, the air stilly. A knock came. It was Gloria, the director. She stepped in quietly. No clipboard. No condescension. "I underestimated you," she said. "No," I replied. "You underestimated all of us." She nodded. "Some of the staff are scared. They think the culture here is ruined." I smiled gently. It was already broken. Now it's exposed. She didn't argue. After a long silence, she said, "What would you call this chapter?" "Which one?" "This movement. This moment." I thought for a second, then answered, "Chapter 11. The one where the characters take the pen back." Jennifer stayed overnight in a guest suite. In the morning, she joined me in the courtyard, coffee in hand. "You changed lives, Mom." I shook my head. "We changed the narrative." She watched the maple tree, Ruth's tree, sway in the breeze. Its leaves were beginning to turn gold. "It's strange," she said. "Growing up, I thought your fierceness was just stubbornness. Now I understand it was survival." I didn't reply. I just reached for her hand, and she let me hold it. Not as a child needing guidance, not as a caregiver needing permission, but as a daughter finally seeing her mother whole, undiminished. More stories were recorded. We created an archive, the difficult tapes. Each resident who wanted to participate shared one memory they had been told to forget, one decision they fought to make, and one piece of advice for someone just entering a care facility. We didn't coach them. We didn't edit. We let them speak. Unfiltered, uncontrolled, unapologetic. It became part of orientation for new staff. Some cried, some quit, some returned stronger. That was the point. And then one afternoon, Bernice approached me in the hallway. She was smiling. "They approved my request," she said. "For what?" "To go home. My son's moving in. I'm leaving next week." I blinked. "That's wonderful." She nodded. "I wouldn't have had the courage to ask if I hadn't met you." I hugged her gently, carefully. "Promise me something," I said. "Anything. If they ever call you difficult again, smile." She laughed. "With teeth." The day Bernice left, we tied one final ribbon on Ruth's tree. Bright red, hope-colored, a mark of survival. And beneath it, a small wooden sign painted by Theo and carved by Clarissa. Here grew the ones they tried to silence. When Bernice left, the hall felt emptier, but not in the way it used to. Not in the way of someone disappearing quietly, resigned to the void. She left like a door swinging open, and suddenly the air shifted again. Not with fear, with possibility. Because if one of us could leave, truly leave under our own terms, what else could be reclaimed? Edith, the former librarian, came to my door 2 mornings later with a folder full of papers. "I've been researching," she said. "State regulations, care standards, licensing requirements. We've only just scratched the surface." I invited her in and made tea. She was quiet, meticulous. She pointed to a clause in the Residence' Rights Code. "This here," she tapped, "gives us the right to vote on internal policy committees if we form one." "No one's ever done that," I said. She smiled. "Then let's be the first." We drafted a petition, formal, legal, clear. 32 residents signed it. The administration had no choice but to recognize our right to convene. And so the first Resident Policy Advisory Committee was formed. 5 women, 2 men, 1 Theo as our volunteer secretary. We weren't just speaking now. We were writing rules. It was during one of those committee meetings that Clarissa stood and made a suggestion. "I think it's time," she said, "we start teaching." "Teaching what?" I asked. She held up one of her pamphlets. "How to survive here. How to speak up. How to document, report, protect yourself. The things we learned the hard way." I looked around the table. No one disagreed. And so we created the Difficult Women curriculum. We offered it once a week in the Hearthwood Library. We called it something gentle for the brochure, Resident Empowerment Hour, but we knew what it was. It was fire carefully passed from hand to hand. One week, a new woman named Esther arrived. She was withdrawn, sharp-featured. From a hospital transfer, we were told. She said very little. Aides whispered that she was mean. I heard one say she had a history of aggressive behavior. I sat with her at lunch. After 10 silent minutes, I said, "Do you want to know what they called me?" "My first week here." She raised an eyebrow. "Combative, non-compliant, borderline unstable." Her eyes narrowed. "You don't look it." I smiled. "Exactly." She didn't laugh, but she didn't leave either. 2 days later, Esther showed up to the Empowerment Hour. She didn't speak, but she took notes. The following week, she raised her hand and asked, "Is it legal to record medication administration without consent?" Clarissa answered, "If you're the patient, you are the consent." Esther smiled slightly. She returned every week after that. The changes piled up, not in announcements but in small victories. Aides began asking before adjusting pillows. Residents received printed summaries of their prescriptions. The activity board now included sessions on patient rights and writing your own advance directive. A small wins column was added to the bulletin board. Bernice moved home. Clarissa's son donated 20 sketch pads to the art room. 2 residents switched doctors after lodging formal complaints. Each one a spark. Each one a signal. You're not alone. You're not forgotten. You're not wrong for wanting more. Then one afternoon, Ruth's recorder failed. Theo tried replacing the battery, then the memory chip, but it wouldn't start. "She'd want us to keep going," he said, disappointed. So I took it to my room, sat with it on my desk, stared at the worn edges, the chipped plastic. Then I opened a new notebook. On the first page I wrote, "This is not the end of the recording, just a new medium." And I began to write our curriculum in full. Not just stories, strategies, tactics, quotes, checklists, advice, everything Ruth would have wanted captured. Jennifer reached out again. She'd been consulting with a nonprofit that focused on elder advocacy. They were publishing a book on modern elder resistance case studies, policy proposals, survivor stories. She wanted to include us. I hesitated. Do you think anyone outside these walls really wants to read about old women with notebooks? She smiled over the video call. Mom, they don't know. They need you yet. But when they do, they'll be grateful you wrote it down. So I said yes. When the first draft of the book came back from the editor, I flipped through the pages carefully. There we were. Ruth, Clarissa, Janice, Dora, Bernice, me. The chapter titles made me laugh. The Whisper Network, Compliance Scores and Other Lies, The Difficult Woman's Curriculum. But the last chapter stopped me cold. Chapter 15, Legacy in Progress. It was Theo who had submitted that one. Without telling me, it included transcribed quotes from the women who had passed since our uprising. Janice's, I remember more than they want me to. Ruth's, don't let them turn your body into an apology. Dora's, silence is not dignity. It's surrender. I closed the book and wept not for what we lost, but for what we reclaimed. That evening I sat under Ruth's tree. The red ribbons had faded, but the sapling had grown stronger, its roots deeper, its leaves thick. A young resident sat beside me. Mary, I think her name was, newly arrived, still testing her voice. Do you think we'll ever not be called difficult? She asked. I looked up at the branches swaying. No, I said. But maybe one day they'll say it with reverence. And then I smiled. Because difficult women don't fade. We plant trees. We write books. We leave the record on. Winter crept in slowly that year. The kind of soft gray cold that settles deep into your bones. But inside Hearthwood something glowed. Not from the fluorescence overhead, but from the people, the rhythm of voices that once trembled now filling the halls with clarity. The resistance once whisper-thin had become part of the building's DNA. Even new staff knew it. They came in fresh-faced and eager, but before long they were pulled aside by someone like Carla or Theo and quietly warned. They'll notice everything. Don't pretend they won't. And we did. I started each morning the same way. Sitting by Ruth's tree sipping black coffee. Real coffee now, not decaf by default. Sometimes others join me. Clarissa with her sketches, Edith with her annotated policies, Bernice before she left with her crossword book folded under her arm. On most mornings we didn't need to speak. That was the thing about surviving something together. The words became less important. The presence was everything. One morning Theo brought us news. There's going to be a feature piece, he said breathlessly. The New York Times. They're doing a Sunday column, a full spread on Grace's Circle. Grace's Circle, I asked. It's what they're calling you. It started online. There's even a hashtag Grace Circle. We all blinked. We're trending, Dora said half laughing. Theo nodded. People are using it to share stories about standing up for elderly relatives. It's kind of become a thing. I looked at the others. Ruth would have hated it, but she also would have posted 10 comments under a burner account correcting their grammar. Clarissa said, well, I suppose we're influencers now. I want royalties, Edith muttered. We all laughed. But as the recognition grew, so did the weight. The calls came in from other homes, other groups, reporters, activists. Some asked for interviews. Some wanted strategy. Some begged for advice. At first, we tried to answer them all. But it was exhausting. Not because we didn't care, but because this was supposed to be about living too. I gathered the circle. We need boundaries, I said. We need to protect ourselves from becoming a symbol more than we are people. Clarissa agreed. A martyr still dies. That's not what we fought for. So we created a rule. One day each week without stories. No advocacy, no forms, no meetings. We called it Stillness Sunday. We cooked if we wanted to, sat if we wanted to. Some of us napped. One Sunday Theo brought paint. We painted small rocks and placed them around Ruth's tree. Mine read, "Be hard to silence." Clarissa's said, "Don't confuse quiet with permission." Theo's said simply, "She's watching." A few weeks later, I was asked to give a speech at a statewide conference on elder care reform. I almost said no, but Clarissa handed me a page of quotes from our circle. Ruth's voice echoed through every line. So I said yes. Standing at the podium in a grand hotel ballroom, I began, "They called me difficult." But what they meant was, I still wanted to choose my own story. I spoke for 20 minutes. I didn't read notes. I didn't rehearse. I told them about the napkins, the stolen notebook, the red ribbons. I ended with this: "We don't want to be heroes. We don't want to be hashtags. We want our coffee hot. We want to choose our medicine. We want to be asked, not handled. We want above all to be heard. And we will be, even if it takes every last breath." The applause was not polite. It was thunderous. When I returned to Hearthwood, there was a bouquet waiting in my room. No card. Just a slip of paper inside. "Because of you, I asked for the truth." And they had to give it. I never found out who sent it. I didn't need to. Then came the storm. A literal one. A blizzard knocked out power in 3 facilities nearby. Hearthwood went into emergency protocol. But this time we weren't just told what to do. We were consulted. Evelyn, the new shift lead, said, "Do you think we should move residents to the East Hall or keep them in their rooms?" I blinked. "You're asking me." He nodded. "You've been through this before. We made a plan. It worked. Everyone stayed safe. And more importantly, everyone felt seen." Weeks passed. The tree grew. We added more stones. One afternoon, Clarissa drew Ruth's tree again, but this time she included us all beneath it. Not frail, not sickly, not forgotten. Strong, upright, laughing. A forest where once there was just one sapling. That night I sat at my desk, pulled out my latest notebook. On the first page I wrote, "It began with a whisper, but it lives now in the roots. And beneath it, the fire is still warm. Let them come closer." A letter arrived that changed everything. Not from a lawyer, not from a journalist, not from a policymaker. It was from a girl named Lily, 11 years old. She wrote it in pencil, folded neatly into an envelope with a sticker of a yellow daisy on the seal. "Dear Miss Evelyn, my grandma said you're the bravest lady in the world. I told my class about you. Now we're making a book called Brave Women Who Speak Up. My teacher says you're our real-life Rosa Parks. I hope I can be difficult one day, too." I read the letter 3 times. Then I cried. Not out of sorrow, but because I realized something profound. We hadn't just saved ourselves. We had become a blueprint. The book Lily's class created made its way to Hearthwood 2 weeks later. Each page illustrated by hand. Clarissa's page had her holding a clipboard like a sword. Ruth's page showed a tree with red ribbons fluttering like flags. Mine, a small gray-haired woman in a red sweater holding a megaphone shaped like a teacup. It wasn't accurate, but it was perfect. I decided to frame Lily's letter. Hung it beside the first page of my original red notebook. 2 sentences side by side. "They called me difficult. I hope I can be difficult one day, too." That was the arc. From stigma to aspiration, from silence to legacy. We held a celebration. Not for me, for the 1-year anniversary of our first recorded meeting. We gathered in the courtyard under Ruth's tree. Theo organized a slideshow. Clarissa printed a poster. 1 year louder in hand-lettered calligraphy. Edith baked cookies. Real ones. Not the soft diet-safe kind. Even Gloria, the director, stood up and made a short speech. To think she said the ones we once underestimated would now define how we operate. She raised her glass of lemonade. "To difficult women," she said. And this time, everyone, residents, aide, staff, even visiting family, repeated it with her. "To difficult women." That evening, I sat by the tree with Clarissa and Dora. "Do you think," Dora asked, "will be remembered?" Clarissa smiled. "We already are." Then she handed me something, a bound book, printed glossy cover. The Difficult Woman's Curriculum. She had finished it, edited, designed, indexed. It was real. Inside, chapter after chapter of everything we'd learned. How to spot manipulation in care language. How to read your own medical chart. How to write grievances that get read. At the end was a page of quotes. Some from Ruth, some from Janice, some anonymous. But the last one, it was mine. We were not rebels. We were not martyrs. We were simply women who remembered that our lives still belonged to us. I started mailing out copies the next day. 1 to Lily's school. 1 to a senator's office. 20 to a statewide advocacy group. Each time I licked an envelope, I felt like I was sealing a piece of us into the future. Not in bitterness. In blueprint. Spring arrived again. Ruth's tree bloomed early soft buds of green and gold. We tied new ribbons, not just red anymore. Yellow for hope, blue for persistence, green for growth. I watched from my chair as new residents approached the tree, reading the sign beneath it, running fingers over the painted stones. One woman sat beside it for nearly an hour. She never said a word. But she came to the next empowerment hour and stayed. Jennifer visited with a surprise. We found a publisher, she said, for the full memoir. Not difficult, just awake. That's the title they want. I laughed. Sounds like an herbal tea. She winked. Or a battle cry. We toasted with hot coffee. Strong black, unsweetened, just how I liked it. Freedom in a cup. At night now, I sleep with the window open. Not because I'm waiting, but because I'm listening. For birds. For wind. For the hum of a world I once thought I'd been shut out from. But I'm not shut out. I'm written in, because even as my body softens, even as my bones whisper their complaints, my voice is sharper than it's ever been. And if one day I forget everything, my name, my notebooks, my own face in the mirror, I hope someone finds a ribbon on that tree, and a voice in that book, and remembers what it meant to be labeled difficult, and choose to speak anyway. This isn't the end. It's the echo of a whisper that became a name that became a movement that became... I never meant to become anyone's symbol. I just wanted my coffee strong and my voice respected. But somehow, in the simple act of refusing to disappear, we started something bigger, something that kept moving even when we sat still, even when some of us couldn't sit up at all anymore. The final story I want to tell isn't mine. It belongs to a woman named Frances. She arrived one overcast morning with no fanfare, no family, no visitors, just a faded coat and a pair of gloves, far too warm for spring. The staff called her quiet. The aides called her strange. But I saw something else. A woman who had watched the world decide who she was without ever asking her first. It took weeks before she spoke, not because she was mute, because she was listening. Then one day, as I sat beneath Ruth's tree, she walked over with a folded napkin. My heart jumped. I hadn't seen one in months. She placed it in my lap, turned, and walked away. No words. Just that gesture. I unfolded it carefully. It read, "I remember everything." I just stopped being invited to speak. I blinked back tears. Not because it was sad, because it was familiar. I wrote back, folded my reply the same way. "Then come sit with us. The invitation is permanent." Frances became a regular. She never spoke much, but when she did, it was thunder. One evening, after a discussion on power of attorney abuse, she raised her hand and said, "If they fear our voices, they must know what we say is true." We wrote that down, made it the header for our next newsletter. Frances never looked for the spotlight. She didn't want to teach. She didn't want to lead. She just wanted space to exist on her terms. And that was more than enough. I've learned in the long arc of these days that dignity isn't something they can hand you. It's something you reclaim in conversations, in refusals, in knowing your own worth without waiting for validation. That's the thing about difficult women. We're not born difficult. We become that way by surviving systems designed to forget us. And when I die, because yes, it's coming, I don't want roses. I don't want plaques. I don't want "she was kind" written on some laminated program. I want this. Someone to find one of our booklets in a facility I've never stepped foot in. To hold it, read it, and feel not alone. To see my name, Evelyn Stroud, and know that at least one woman once stood her ground. And maybe they'll add their name to the list. Maybe they'll tie a ribbon. Maybe they'll fold a napkin and slide it under a door. Because fire spreads in whispers. Justice begins with remembering, and sometimes the loudest scream is the softest woman refusing to sit down. This is the final entry in this notebook. Not because the story ends here, but because the pages are full. Because the tree has grown tall. Because Grace's truth now has many names. Mine is just the first. And if they still call me difficult, let them, because I've seen what difficult women do. We save each other, one voice at a time. There's something sacred about the closing of a story, not because it ends, but because it leaves behind echoes. This one began with a single woman, labeled, observed, silenced. But what they didn't count on was that silence remembers. It studies, it listens, and when the time is right, it speaks. Grace's truth was never just mine. It was Janice's hands folded in protest, Ruth's voice breaking through sedation, Clarissa's sketches etched in resistance, Theo's presence bridging generations, and every woman who ever whispered, "I'm still here." If you've come this far, reader, listener, fellow soul, you're part of the circle now. You've sat with us under the tree. You've folded the napkin. You've seen what they tried to hide. And if you ever find yourself in a room where the air grows thick with dismissal, where your opinions are brushed aside, where you are told to sit down, to be quiet, to stop making it hard, don't be difficult. Ask the questions. Write the notes. Speak the story no one else will, because someone is watching, someone is waiting for permission, and your courage might just be their beginning. We were never waiting for a hero. We were waiting for each other. And now that we've found one another, there's no going back. Tie your ribbon, raise your voice, and let them remember us, not as the elderly, not as the fragile, but as the women who chose truth when silence was easier. Let this be our final word, and your first step